Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. And tonight, we're going to take a little trip. We're going to a place called Lucknow, Ontario, where I've never been. And we're going to a farmhouse. And we're going to visit a local farmer, but a very prominent farmer named Tony McQuail. Hi, Tony.
Hi, Metta. How are you?
I'm doing great. We're on a farm called, let's see, I wrote it down, Meeting Place Organic Farm. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, we
Good.
bought the farm in 1973, and the house we're in we built in 74, 75. It's a passive solar home, and we do our supplemental heating with wood.
So you were already in the 70s, you were already mindful about living in harmony with the energy sources, right? Do you
Well,
want
that
to?
was our goal. I mean, we'd come through the Arab oil embargo and certainly realized that fossil fuels were a non-renewable fuel
Huh?
and also had environmental consequences from their use. We weren't as aware of the global warming implications in the 70s.
So I got to you originally by calling some people at a place called the Holistic Management Institute, which is, I think, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I had approached them because I wanted answers to questions that had arisen in my mind as I read more and more about the impact of animals on the soil and on whether or not it'd be possible to sequester carbon by maintaining herds of animals, cattle and goats and sheep, etc. And so that's been on my mind a lot lately. And I can't seem to get any good ideas as to whether the evidence is firm and how much we can count on either good or bad effects of cows. I've just written a paper called Can Trees and Cows Save Us? Because I've been trying to appraise the value of these or the detrimental impact, as it may be, of both forests and ruminant animals. So that's why I call the holistic management people, and they thought I ought to talk to somebody who might be more like a neighbor, and that's you. So let's start off, if you don't mind, by trying to disentangle some terms that keep tripping me up because I hear I've always heard, of course, of organic farming, and I thought I knew what that was, but I'm not sure I know what some of these other things are. I don't know for sure what permaculture is and how that's connected to organic farming. I don't know exactly what I think I know a little more about holistic management, which is, I think, coming out of Alan Savory's work. And then there's something called agroecology, which is another term. And then I've been joining groups on Facebook, social groups, having to do with regenerative farming and even regenerative grazing. And who are you, by the way? What kind of identity do you have in this plethora of terminology?
Well, in terms of this plethora of terminology, you can wear many of the hats. They aren't necessarily exclusive. Um, Organic agriculture was in some ways started by Albert Howard and then the Rodeos in Pennsylvania. And it now is a um, codified system in Canada where there's a set of criteria and regulations that if you're certified organic, you have to meet.
They are people who avoid pesticides and that sort of thing. Isn't that the main idea?
It has a much more positive side in terms of trying to work with the ecosystem, looking to maintain fertility by using compost and good crop rotations, um, trying to look at weed and insect control, again, by how you manage the system and crop rotations. And so it's trying to use biological systems rather than synthetic chemicals. It's in line with what might be considered the regenerative agriculture. The regenerative agriculture term, I think, has come into more prominent usage because it can apply to a much wider range of farmers than the certified organic. Permaculture was developed and initially, I think, utilized by a fellow named Bill Mollison, who was talking about trying to design a permanent agriculture. And it has a number of very creative ideas and approaches. And some people have been working to try and scale it up to an agricultural as opposed to a garden or homestead scale. You know, there was the term sustainable agriculture for a while. It's tended to fall out of use because I think a number of people feel that we're not trying to sustain where we are. We're trying to regenerate and become better than we have been in agriculture in the last while.
Oh, so we're
And
not just
certainly,
trying to stop doing damage, but we're supposed to actually improve the quality of the environment by.
a good many of the people who'd be involved in the regenerative, ecological, permaculture, organic agriculture groups is to how do we improve our soils? How do we increase their water holding capacity? How do we make better use of our sunshine? Because really, as farmers, we're in the business of turning sunlight into substance, into food and fiber, fuel, and we do that through photosynthesis. And this is where we sort of differ with the sort of industrial agriculture approach, which has been to try and create a very industrial model for agriculture and to be very focused on the output from the system rather than the health of the whole system. And so you'll see farms where they try and keep the soil basically bare except for the crop that they're trying to grow. But that means there are months that they aren't capturing the sunlight that's hitting their soil and turning it into carbohydrates and biomass, which then can feed soil microorganisms and protect the soil.
The things that you've mentioned are all, or at least mostly, you could be any one of them and both of them or all of them.
I mean, there are people who consider what we do to have a significant chunk of permaculture aspects to it. Certainly, a lot of our activities and the things that we're managing to accomplish would be very consistent with regenerative agriculture. We helped start the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario 40 years ago as a way of helping farmers share information and learn from each other's both successes and mistakes.
You said the ecological farming. Is that agroecology?
I think agroecology has been more of a term developed in the academic discussion of agriculture, talking about an agriculture that is more focused in thinking about the ecology of the system where it's located and how to integrate agriculture into the larger ecosystem in a beneficial way. Ecological agriculture, regenerative agriculture, all would fit into the agroecological framework.
What kind of language do you use to describe monoculture, the bad guys?
Well, I mean, let's not turn this into bad guys and good guys.
All right.
Farmers have been under a lot of pressure in the last 50 years to get bigger or get out. And there's been a huge push to encourage industrial agriculture, encourage a system that tries to simplify production to sort of a formula that can be applied over a wide acreage and thus provide a market for a whole bunch of industrial inputs, chemical fertilizers, herbicides, fungicides, insecticides. It's become, the farms themselves have just become a little production segment of this whole long industrial food chain. And with the equipment manufacturing inputs, the chemical inputs, the seed inputs, and of course the seed industry has gotten more and more concentrated as well. The farmers have been under a lot of pressure to participate in this system, but they've been the most heavily exploited participants in it, getting the smallest returns and working on very narrow margins, which has forced them to push harder and harder. And I think that in many ways, a more ecological approach to operating their farm offers people a chance to get off of that treadmill and get out of that, to me, both an ecologically destructive trap, but also an economically and socially destructive trap. Because as farmers have gotten bigger, the ability of people to be real careful stewards and pay close attention to their particular piece of land becomes harder as they're working larger and larger acreages, and it means that there are fewer and fewer people in the rural community to support the local towns, have kids in the schools, and that sort of thing. So it's really been pushed to the point that for many farmers looking for an alternative, and this was certainly where things were with the organic movement 30 years ago, we were seeing people come to organics because the conventional system wasn't working for them and their family or their farm. And we know a great deal more now about how to make a successful transition from the chemical dependent agriculture, the industrial model of agriculture, to a much more regenerative model.
And have it work. You can make a good living doing it that way.
You can. It takes good management, and it also is really helped if the consumer, if the person buying food says, I've got some concerns. I want my food to be produced in a way that improves the environment rather than degrades it. I want my food to be nutrient-dense, nutrient-rich, and I want animals to be raised in a way that feels ethical to me. Those are all ways, if you're willing to pay for that, then the farmers who are producing in that manner can make a living. But the other thing is, when you're working with the ecosystem and with the sort of rules of the environment, in a lot of ways things become easier. You may have to put in more management. You may not be spending as much on chemical fertilizer or pesticides, but now you're investing more time and effort in trying to create a system on your farm that meshes with the requirements of your local environment. So it's a much more localized and intentionally and intensively managed system in many ways.
Well, is it harder work? In other words, are you using fewer machines, labor-saving devices, as it were?
It depends. There are so many different types of farming that it depends.
Okay.
Certainly, in some cases, folks have made the transition and found that in some ways it's less work and it's more enjoyable work and it's less input costs, and so they have greater security because they aren't spending as much money up front on the inputs. And one of the really exciting to me win-win-win possibilities is that if you manage your grazing or you manage your cropping so that you're sequestering carbon in the soil and building up your soil organic matter, you're also increasing your resilience in the face of flooding or drought, because each 1% increase in soil organic matter increases your soil's water holding capacity by about 25,000 gallons of water per acre. And what that means is if you have a big rainfall event, instead of having that water run off, you're now got porous structure, you've got a lot of microbial activity, earthworm activity, and the water can penetrate into your soil and be held there, and both in the soil and mixed in with the organic matter. And what that means also is if you then end up in a drought situation, you've got all this greater water holding capacity in your soil, help your crops through or your pastures through a droughty period. So, what that means is if you had a whole watershed practicing regenerative agriculture, the towns and villages would be less likely to experience serious flooding events. Municipalities would have to spend less money on flood infrastructure materials or facilities, and you'd have a agricultural area that was better able to both absorb water in a deluge and survive an extended dry period.
I'm thinking just about the question of whether we're going to be able to feed the world. I was reading something recently that said we're going to hit a maximum of 11 billion people on this planet. I had thought that the population was going to level off before it got there, but it may actually hit 11 billion. And the question, as I understand it, lots of places in the world is going through degradation of soil. The water is washing soil away, as you've just referred to, and blowing it away, creating deserts or degraded soil, so that we only have, I think, one estimate of about 100 more harvests in the soil that exists now. Well, I had always heard that it takes, like 1,000 years or something to build an inch of topsoil, that it comes from weathering stones that get put on the soil and so on. But I'm hearing people talk now about how just by farming properly, you can take carbon and nutrients, and the roots will put it into the soil, and you build your topsoil fairly quickly. Tell me about that. Which is right?
Well, I think if you were starting with a bare boulder and lichens and things like that, it might take a 1,000 years to build an inch of topsoil. But if you're already talking about soil of some sort of mineral matrix, you can build biologically active, rich topsoil much, much more quickly. But what we've discovered is that plants, are up here gathering the sunlight, photosynthesizing, producing carbohydrates, and then that stuff moves down into the roots. The plant roots have a whole microbial population, bacteria, fungi living around them, connected to them, that are actually being fed by the photosynthate coming from the growing plant. So the more diverse the structure of the plants growing in an area, the more diverse and deep the biological activity in the soil. So, but the regenerative farming movement is looking at now is how do we keep growing plants, living plants, photosynthesizing on our soil as long as possible. Now in Canada, we don't have an unlimited growing season. You're going to get snow here. Things are going to slow down. But if you're in a cropping system, you've got your crop that you're growing to produce something to sell. Corn, wheat, soybeans, lentils, maybe canola, whatever. But there may be a period after the crop is harvested that you could have something growing on that field. And are there ways to interseed what we would now call a cocktail crop rather than just a cover crop?
No. What's a cocktail crop?
Get there. When I was first, starting to farm, we talked about having a cover crop, and it was something you planted after or before your main crop that would keep the soil covered, help cut down on weeds, help build your soil organic matter, and those were things like rye or buckwheat. Now, when we talk about a cocktail crop, rather than planting just one species of cover crop, you may plant a whole mixture. And so you plant some things that are leguminous that will fix nitrogen, clovers, peas, beans, phacelia, a whole range of stuff. You may plant some of the brassicas, things like oil radish or turnip or beets, and also some of the grasses, rye, wheat, oats, barley, and other things. So there's a whole range of stuff, and if you mix these things together, when I was at agricultural college, they said, well, you only want to plant the thing you want because competition will stunt your crop. Well, when you plant a cocktail crop, it's a cocktail because it's a big mixture, right? A cocktail crop, it's amazing how the whole thing sort of synergistically interacts. You've got deep roots, you've got shallow roots, you've got fibrous roots, you've got tap roots, all these different things feeding the soil and feeding the microbial population and creating a much more diverse and biologically active soil. And so you're putting carbon directly in through the root exudates, and then if it's a cover crop that you're going to mow or graze off, then the top also gets left there to decompose, either as the cut residue or the livestock manure that it's been turned into as it's been digested by the livestock. So you can quite rapidly improve a soil with that kind of cocktail crop. And when we're talking about a cocktail cover crop, you're trying to plant it so that your soil is covered up to the point where you plant your cash crop, your corn or your soybeans,
Mm-hmm.
whatever, or is covered after that is harvested. And people are also experimenting in ways of using the cover crop as a mulch. If you have either a winter-killed cover crop, let's say you plant things in the early fall that are going to grow and are fairly cold tolerant and will grow right up until they're covered with snow. So they're photosynthesizing every time they get a sunny day and get some sunlight to work with, but then freeze and die over the winter. And there's this mulch of dead plant material on the surface, which will
Mm-hmm.
help pull weeds, help hold moisture, and you can plant through that with the modern no-till drills, the planting systems that are designed to plant through a residue. And you know, you've kept your soil covered, you've been feeding the microbes all through that period.
Mm-hmm. If you're raising this cocktail cover crop or any other kind of cover crop, and then you try to plant your cash crop, isn't that stuff going to compete?
It depends on how you design your system. There are some cover crops that if they are rolled at the right time, flattened out, they'll actually die at that point and serve as a dead mulch. As I said, you can use something that'll winter kill. But another way to deal with it is to graze it and to have the animals chew it off and then plant into it. And that's one of the other things that the scale of agriculture has created problems, because ideally you should be planting the seeds for your main crop or your cash crop at a time when the soil is at the right temperature for them, the right moisture level, so that those seeds germinate quickly, get off rapidly, develop a canopy, and are able to compete then with either weeds or escapes from your cash crop or your cocktail crop. So,
My grandfather was a farmer in Oklahoma, and I remember the pride of his life was when he bought a John Deere tractor, because until that point he'd had to plow with a horse, and I think of that man's life having spent many years going up and down and back and forth, the whole that was his life, is walking behind a horse with a plow. Why did they do it if it was unnecessary? That amount of work is just terrible. And why would people have invented plowing in the first place?
Well, as a way of knocking off a sod in particular, so that you could then grow a grain crop of some sort. It lets you prepare a good seed bed. And they didn't have the kind of no-till equipment now, which can prepare a very small, narrow trench of a seed bed to get good germination for seeds. But a significant part of it was for weed control. But another part of it was certainly in North America, they were breaking up prairies. They were breaking up areas that had been under indigenous agriculture and had been managed much more as a savanna. But it was largely to create a seed bed, to create a soil structure that allow for easy planting and good germination.
And they didn't know that it was possible to just put the seeds in with a drill of some kind, and that doesn't it save a lot of work, the way you guys do it?
Well, at this point we're primarily a hay and pasture farm, so we aren't using those particular technologies. But certainly, if you can basically manage your green manure crops to both prepare the soil and provide your weed control, and then use modern no-till drill to just go over, you're only making one pass. Whereas historically in this part of the world, you would plow the ground, fall plow it, and then possibly disc, cultivate, and harrow it before you would plant it. So you made a lot more trips over the soil. And one of the challenges in terms of carbon is that each time you disturb the soil, you're creating sort of a flush of microbial activity that's actually breaking down the carbon in the soil, the soil soil organic matter, and oxidizing it and releasing it as carbon dioxide. And also you're damaging the fungal hyphae in the soil. So figuring out ways to minimize tillage can certainly be helpful. But in heavy clay soils, and our area is clay, sometimes the plowing or working of the land was helpful in terms of having what was called the frost, freezing and thawing of the soil, helping create a much finer soil structure. But as you improve the organic matter of the soil, then the soil already has that structure through the organic matter in it and the way the little soil aggregates hold together. So you don't need frost action on the clay structure to break it.
It's time now to talk about carbon, because it's my main interest, at least equal to the question of whether we can feed the planet, is the question of, can we sequester carbon? And can we not only stop emitting carbon, because I understand agriculture is a major source of carbon now, into the dioxide, into the air, but I understand it is also one of the two most promising ways of sequestering carbon. I think the French introduced something called 4 per mille a few years ago as a goal for how much soil how much carbon to try to put into the soil so as to reverse the trend and have soil become a major sink for carbon instead of a source of carbon. And I understand, along with forestry, that regenerative farming or carbon farming is the most promising way of reversing global warming. Now, tell me how that goes, whether it's true, and I also know that I've heard that everything depends on how you do it, what kind of farming you use. So, what's the latest word on how to use regenerative farming for the sake of preventing global warming?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that farming contributes a great deal of carbon dioxide just through the industrial side of it, so that in the manufacture of the equipment, the fueling of the equipment, the manufacturing of the fertilizers and the pesticides, that's all pretty energy intensive stuff. And then of course that whole food chain where it goes then to processing and our food distribution system. So the closer we can put people and food production together so that we don't have these long energy intensive agricultural food supply chains, that's an important thing for us to think about. But in terms of farming itself, it's not only that energy usage, but it's also each time we drop soil organic matter, that was carbon stored in the soil as organic matter that's now been oxidized and added to the CO2 load in the atmosphere. So there's a book I rather like. It's called Conquest of the Land Through 7,000 Years. Mm-hmm. The U.S. Department of Agricultural soil scientists who went and looked at areas that had been the seat of civilization, where civilization had started, and he found all these areas that were now deserts or had great big buildings that were in the middle of nowhere and buried in sand because they hadn't looked after their soil. And they had destroyed their soil, and then their society withered and died. With a global civilization, which we're at this point, if we don't start taking care of our soils all across the globe, we could end up looking like this over the whole planet. I don't think that looks very attractive to me. That's an ancient civilization that ain't there no more.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so what we're looking at, and I think agriculture does have the most potential because we're already working this land. And we don't need new equipment or new technology. We just need to manage how we're doing it differently. And that's both in terms of our cropping systems, but also in terms of our livestock systems. And if people who are watching this Google Alan Savory and desertification, they'll find some interesting YouTubes where he talks about his experience um, and his development of holistic management. But what's happened with livestock is we've moved most of it into confinement, and what's not in confinement is often just running around in one big pasture or one big area, and you're getting both overgrazing and undergrazing on those pastures, and you're getting none of the benefits of livestock on the land in confinement systems. And we have to recognize, well, where did the carbon go that was up in the atmosphere that made it an unlivable atmosphere millennia ago or billions of years ago? And that was green plants turned it into fossil fuels or into soil organic matter, deep, rich prairie soils, deep, rich pampa soils, savanna soils, and also then the coral reefs were sequestering carbon in calcium carbonate. But you know, it was the relationship between livestock and the plants and the land that created the rich agricultural soils that we're now using and that we're depleting the organic matter from.
Mm-hmm.
And they did it because they grazed differently. When there were large herds of ruminant animals, things like cows, buffalo, wildebeest, whatever, they were kept bunched by predators. And so they would be in a fairly tight group, graze an area very thoroughly, put manure and urine on it, and then they'd move on and graze another area. And so the plants that they had grazed had a chance to fully recover, put their roots back down into the soil, and you had this pulsing of organic matter and carbon dioxide going deeper into the soil. And that's the kind of thing that through holistic management, that's how we manage our livestock. And so move them around, but using electric fence rather than predators. And if we were to take our cropping systems and also then say take our confinement livestock and use them to eat crop residue and put urine and manure on the land to fertilize it. This is the sort of thing that a fellow named Gabe Brown has been working with. And again, if people Google Gabe Brown, they can find some interesting YouTubes describing the incredible things that have happened on their farm in terms of its ability to absorb torrential groundfalls and hold on to the water as they deepen the soil and are productive.
Well, you know, I was just enchanted by watching some of Alan Savory's stuff. I've looked at a lot of those videos, not only the famous TED Talk, but others that have been made since then. And I must say, I certainly am persuaded, but I have a lot of friends who tell me I'm full of bunk, that this that it hasn't been proved, and that the notion, well, of course, there are different things that he's asserting. Number one is he's asserting that you can make a lot more, you can produce a lot more meat by having a lot more cows on your land than you might have otherwise been able to sustain, and that you improve the pasture and the places where they graze by moving them around and treating them just right. He has good technology for that. I don't think anybody much disagrees with that nowadays, but I do hear people saying, but we have to stop eating meat, which means we have to stop raising cows, because cows produce methane from both ends, and cows are a major source of global warming. Therefore, the most prevailing opinion among environmentalists is that we absolutely have to get rid of cattle and animal herbivores. Uh, so I took a little effort to try to find out what the science says about carbon sequestration. If my calculation is that, or my theorizing is that if you are putting a lot of carbon into the soil, then how much methane you're emitting from the cow's front and back ends has to be balanced against that. The cattle are both putting sequestering carbon and in a way creating methane by their digestive system, the microbes in their stomach and so on. So the question in my mind is, are we winning or losing with cattle by herding animals, even in the optimum way, the holistic management way, which you've started to elaborate, but we could talk a lot more about that. If you farm that way with animals, are you doing the world a favor, or are we? Should you stop doing it, and we should all just eat vegetables and plant-based protein?
Well, if you're going to grow them on your own backyard, I'd say go ahead and eat the vegetables. But I think if you look at it and think about it, there were a whole lot of ruminant animals roaming this planet, both eating stuff and giving off methane, and they weren't upsetting the balance. I think the the problem is if you're raising animals in confinement, then you don't get the benefits of the deeper rooting, pasture, soils, carbon sequestration that you get when you're managing grazing animals properly. And but one of our great challenges is our scientific method is not really very good at figuring out the intricacies of complex webs of relationships. Mm-hmm. And we get all these things. I mean, when I was a kid, it came out that margarine was better for you than butter. And my father, when I brought this back to him from third grade, said, well, I've seen margarine being made, and I think eating stuff that's closer to its natural source makes a lot of sense to me. And butters come back into being seen as perhaps a good option, or at least not too many people would necessarily claim margarine was the best thing in the world. So, if I look at the big picture of how things worked in the ecosystem on this planet before we got into agriculture 10,000 years ago, and then before we got into industrial agriculture really less than a century ago, I would say that livestock being managed on land in ways that increase the biodiversity of the plant life, the microbiology of the soil, and also perhaps increase the wildlife and shelter belt areas because of the way you're managing and putting in some trees and some hedgerows and having shelter for your livestock, probably going to be a lot more beneficial than eating tofu that was grown on land that was cleared in the Brazilian rainforest areas. You've got to look at the whole picture, and an awful lot of what vegetarians eat is pretty highly processed and may not be any better for the environment in terms of the amount of energy that went into the equipment that got used to grow the soybeans that got made into the tofu. So,
well, there are various arguments, one having to do with health, our health, and the claim is that people who eat meat are sicker. And there's been a lot of research recently that I've actually done some investigating on, and it looks like there's really not much of any difference between meat eating and not. But so I don't even take the health consideration into account. But I sure as heck would like to see some absolutely scientifically impeccable research that would show whether or not raising cattle in the optimum way is going to improve the soil carbon content or whether it is not. And as a matter of fact, just a couple of hours ago, I found a document, an article, which I will mention the title to, if I can find it. Yes, here it is. It's by Teague et al., Teague et al., a number of people. The role of ruminants in reducing agriculture's carbon footprint in North America. It was published in 2016. And they do try to create empirically sound projections about the type of, the amount of carbon that could be sequestered if people use the right methods of grazing animals and so on. And they claim that in North America, if 100% of the grazing land happened to be turned over to use by holistic management methods, the system that you've referred to, that about 1.2 gigatons of carbon, not CO2, but carbon, would be sequestered in the soil. So that's just in North America. That's a big step forward. That would really mean that cows almost certainly would be doing us a favor by this. The other question, and I want to ask about empirical evidence, if you can find it, but the other thing I came across recently was a reference to the type of bacteria that live in the soil. That there's a kind of bacterium, the category of bacteria called methanotropic bacteria, which actually are capable of breaking down the CO2 molecule. And that would mean that...
the methane molecule that it breaks down, not the CO2.
I beg your pardon. Thank you, you're right, yes. And that it's very few things can break down the methane molecule. And that would, if you have a whole lot of those bacteria in the soil, that would potentially, I guess the amount that you could sequester would be largely a function of how many of those methanotropic bacteria you have. And I don't know what the conditions are under which they like to live, but I think they mostly like swamps. Anyway, I've asked a lot of questions here. Sorry.
That are giving off methane and providing the resource. I mean, that's the complexity of biological systems. But one of the to me exciting things is that moving to a much more regenerative agriculture all across the planet would increase the health of the soils in areas that are currently degrading, would improve the food access and quality in areas that are drought stricken and that. So there's huge potential. And certainly in North America, I don't know if you're familiar, but when I was involved with the Minister of Agriculture in the early 90s, we helped develop something called the Environmental Farm Plan, which is a system that helps farmers look at their farm and think about aspects of the environment that they should be considering. And it seems to me that what we really need at this point is a national regenerative farm plan that would help individual farmers look at their farm and say, okay, what are the regenerative practices that I can implement now? And that would support farmers. The environmental farm plan is well supported, has peer review process, and helps individual farmers develop plans for their farm. And a similar kind of concept at the national level for a regenerative agriculture plan, farm plan that would help farmers really both have access to the knowledge and the ideas of cutting edge regenerative agriculture practices, and then the help to access the seeds and the technologies and the ideas to put them into practice on their own farms that help us make that transition much more rapidly. Mm-hmm. And I suspect that if you have a much better grazing system and livestock out on the land, you may find that those methanophore bacteria are starting to multiply in the soils that have a close working relationship with livestock on the land. because they won't be there if there isn't, livestock producing the methane for them to live on. So you have to have those things. But one of the things that has been interesting that some of the friends of ours in the holistic management movement in Saskatchewan have been doing is looking at how much carbon's being sequestered versus how much carbon's being released by their animals. And on a number of their farms, for every kilogram emitted by the livestock on the land, 25 kilograms were being sequestered, or 39
Whoa.
kilograms being sequestered.
Wow.
So
don't go further. I want to hear more about, I want to hear, is this written someplace? Is this published?
I can send you.
Because that's, you're saying 1 to 25?
Well, yeah. Well, the low was on the Yurtas farm near Redver, Saskatchewan. They were producing 105 kilograms per hectare of live animal weight, which produced about 1,350 kilograms of CO2, but their land sequestered 22,800 kilograms that year.
Wow.
Or per year, this 4-year period. So for every kilogram that was being emitted, 17 kilograms of CO2 were being sequestered, and several others were higher than that. But the other really exciting thing about that to me is that the way they were managing their farms also meant the water holding capacity in the soil increased, reducing the chance for flooding or drought. Production goes up in dry areas. Holistic management has increased the stocking rate, or the number of animals per acre, by 200 or 300%. That's like getting a second or third farm for free in terms of the number of animals you're able to produce while improving the quality of the land. And then the other thing is the biological activity of the soil increases, so there's better nutrient uptake by the plants, which makes better nutrient-dense food, which is healthier for people, which then lowers health costs, medical costs. And there's also, by managing these systems so that only a small area is being grazed at any one time, you increase the number of flowering plants and the pollinators and the habitat for larger diversity of both pasture birds and endangered wildlife. So there are all these benefits come into play as you manage the livestock or your grazing animals in a much more ecological, regenerative
Okay,
manner.
but now look here. This is extremely exciting to me to hear, because I feel like I'm some sort of dinosaur, still saying that I think that it's okay to eat meat because if it's raised properly, it's good for the planet and not harmful. But I am definitely losing the struggle, because everybody I know is becoming a vegan, or at least switching over to some kind of soy-based or pea-based protein. And I wonder whether even people in government aren't also trying to discourage people from raising livestock, and trying to encourage farmers just to switch over to producing food for human consumption. Do you have any kind of social movement defending your point of view?
Well, certainly the holistic management movement has been trying to encourage people to understand the complex relationship between grazing livestock, healthy land, and healthy people. When you're raising livestock, you're raising food for people, and if you're doing it on grasslands or marginal lands that are better not broken up, not being cash cropped. Cash cropping, some of this was done by grazing, but a lot of it was done by cropping in terms of the degradation of the soil. And certainly in North America, we're creating basically biological deserts that are monocropped oceans of corn or stuff. People say, oh, we're concerned about the monarch butterfly, but if you kill all the milkweed by your herbicides and you have nothing for them to eat, you're creating a real barrier between Canada and Mexico that is very hard for monarchs to traverse, as well as tree swallows and barn swallows and meadowlarks and bobolinks and all the birds that depend on a pasture meadowland structure, and the insects that are part of that healthy system.
I've
One,
heard that we're losing a stupendous number of birds. That, yeah, bird
and
population.
part of that is we've killed their food supply, particularly the insect eaters. And the insect eaters were our friends. They helped the farmer by eating the corn rootworm and the corn earworm. But if we poison the worms, then we have to take on the job that the insect-eating birds were doing. And so creating a better diversified habitat to encourage more insect eaters and not poisoning the insects. That's the interesting thing. There are more and more studies coming out that saying an ecologically managed farm actually has lower pest problems and lower weed problems in some ways because you've got greater biological diversity that's helping address those issues. Certainly,
And I've heard also that their insects become resistant to these things. Yeah.
well, that was one of the interesting things when I was in university in the 70s, taking some tree fruit production courses. They already knew that when they started to spray insecticides in the orchards, they created a whole new group of pests because let's say they were spraying for codling moth. What happens when you spray is you kill off a whole wide range of insects and other things, but you're killing both the target pest insect, but you're also killing its predators and its parasites. But after the spray event, what are the circumstances that those two groups find themselves in? The pest insect, those that survived because they were a little bit resistant to the pesticide or because they didn't get hit, are still surrounded by their food source. But the predators and the parasites, any that survive, when they come out, their food supply is poisoned or dead. And so what you had happening after a spray event is the pest population would rebuild and the predator and parasites of those pests would collapse. And so things that hadn't been a problem in those orchards because they'd been being controlled naturally, and actually the codling moth maybe was only a few percentage in terms of damaged apples. Now you'll have more damage because the pests are surviving more and are becoming resistant to the pesticide, and the predators, parasites are collapsing. And so things that weren't a problem, like mites and other insects, suddenly are freed of their controls and they become an economic problem in the orchard. So the effort to control by killing your problem as opposed to figuring out how to manage it better has not always achieved the results that people want at the time.
Okay, let's talk big now. Let's talk about saving the world because there's so many threats that really are almost existential threats to humankind. We're approaching all kinds of calamities, and certainly global warming is one. And feeding the population of 11 billion is another. We have maybe a couple of years more time to work on that, but those two are the biggies. And I just think that my problem is how to change public opinion, how to inform people, or inform them in ways that they can absorb. Sometimes you can give people information, but they just can't hear it, can't accept it, can't tolerate it. And so you don't get anywhere. And I think public opinion is a much more a matter of group dynamics than it is, how much information is out there. But certainly the public press should provide more accurate information than we're getting. But look, it seems to me there are about three things that we need to do. We need to inform people that once the information is clear, and I don't think I'm surprised to find that there's some positive research showing that, for example, that cattle can do more benefit for the environment and for carbon sequestration than getting rid of them and trying to just live off plant protein. I think I fully understand your point of view on that, and I really hope that there's adequate scientific evidence to prove that, and then make sure that evidence gets out there and that people know, number one, that eating meat doesn't make them sick, it doesn't make them any healthier, but doesn't
Well,
do much for their health, and that raising cattle is not a sinful thing for a farmer to do. Um, and I just wonder what we can do. It seems to me we need a social movement. And, I have this website called tosavetheworld.ca, where we're trying to keep a page for every social movement that's trying to address one or another of the major threats facing humankind. And I would think that agriculture and providing good food uh, for the future while sequestering carbon, handling global warming, and the future of feeding the planet, those two things go hand in hand, and that needs to be a social movement. I'm not aware of any, and if you can put me in touch with people who are creating a global movement to try to promote the kinds of agricultural uh, policies that you've been promoting here in this conversation, I want to know about it because I want to contact them and see if I can give them space so that we can work together on solving a whole bunch of these problems at once.
well, why don't you email me that request, because I'm going to be at the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario conference next week, and it will certainly be sharing, and it would be glad to share and explore that with people there, because I think that movement is starting to grow, and there are an increasing number of people who are starting to realize that one of our biggest destructive impacts on the planet is how we have moved to doing agriculture, and that one of our most promising ways of addressing the challenges of both climate change, global warming, and food security and food sovereignty is to change how we do agriculture and to do it very quickly. The other thing to keep in mind is that we as people need to change what we are doing. We need to put in different design criteria for our societies. For the last 100 years, we have tried to figure out how to substitute fossil fuels for virtually everything in our culture and society. We have substituted it for labor in the supposed labor-saving devices in our machines and equipment. We've substituted it for wood with plastics. We've substituted it for metal with plastic. Fertilizer for natural fertility, pesticides for biological control. And so we have really ramped up our social use of fossil fuels, and that immediately turns into carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We need a redesign criteria that says, how can we do the things we need to do as a society as much as possible with the food energy we put in our mouths, so that we're using our bodies. We aren't going to the gym to get exercise. We're biking to work, we're walking to work, we're redesigning our cities so they're walkable and bikeable, and redoing our zoning so that work, play, and housing all are integrated in ways that let people have more of a community and less of a commuter structure to their lives. And I think we desperately need to reduce our energy use by redesigning how we do things. In a paper I wrote about 10 years where I asked, do we love our machines more than our children? I talked about what I would call the compost conundrum, because we have when you do a compost pile, it heats up not because of CO2 and climate change, it heats up, or greenhouse gas effect. It heats up because of the biological metabolic activity of the soil, of the microorganisms in the compost pile. And we as human beings give off heat because we eat food, but now we give off an awful lot more heat because of the fuel we burn in our equipment and the fuel that gets burned on our behalf in the industrial systems that support us. And those are the things where we're contributing heat to the system and carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And so we've really got to scale that back. So it's not just a simple fix of, well, let's do agriculture. That's a big project, but we've got to change the design criteria that we're using as a society.
Well, the Project Save the World is addressing 6 of the most imminent threats. So we're looking in a bigger sense, but we have to have some separate campaigns, I think. Campaign for regenerative farming, if that's what you want to call yourself now, whatever you want to call yourself, that campaign would be have its own page and have its own argument and have its own lobbying of government, because you need to get to the Ministry of Agriculture and other people in government and tell them that the policies they promote should be ones that actually support these changes.
My sense is that there's a lot more awareness and a lot more interest, and certainly those of us involved in the regenerative agriculture movement need to make sure that our customers understand why what they're supporting is so valuable and so important, and then communicating that more broadly.
Well, you've got my support. Yeah. All right. This has been a joy and a pleasure, and I wish we could keep it up for another hour, but we can't. So thank you so much. I'll be back in touch with you, and I'll send you that. Okay?
Sure. Let me know when you've got it posted, and I'll share it with
yes.
Folks on the email contact list. And if anybody wants to check out our website, it's at Eating Place Organic Farm, believe.ca.
I'll put it on the thing at the end. Okay. Thank you so much, Tony. It's been a joy. Good luck and good wishes.
I admire the work you're doing. When I read over your 6 areas, I thought, yes, those are ones that have been of concern to me for a long time.
Right. Well, okay. Onward, friend. Bye.
Bye-bye.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.